Welcome to College of the Atlantic, the Coffee and Conversation series. Today, we are very excited to have Christina Baker Kline and some other lady here. I'm not sure who that is, but no, we're really we're excited, and I promised Karen that I would keep my own welcome and introduction very short. But for those of you who don't know, Karen is my wife. The first lady of College of the Atlantic. Right? We call her Flo Koa, first lady of College of the Atlantic. Karen she grew up actually, born in Minnesota, grew up in South Carolina. I met her in New Orleans, where I was a graduate student, and Karen was working for the state of Louisiana in the foster care system. We got married and moved to Guatemala for 2 years. I married Karen in November, and then we moved to Guatemala in January, and that was a real expedition. But Karen loved the Exiles and loved so much of Christina's work, but we loved it together. And so when the idea came up, so who should talk with Christina? I said, Karen would do it. A great job.
So
and
nice.
She will. We're super excited. Take it away, y'all.
Thank you.
Yay, thank you.
Thank you. That's the perk of being married to the president. You get to talk to Christina. It is my great privilege to introduce Christina. She is a New York Times bestselling author. She's written 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She's published in over 40 countries. She's also the author of 5 nonfiction books, and her essays, articles, and reviews have been published in periodicals like the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, Psychology Today, et cetera, and so on. Very accomplished. Today, she and I are going to talk about her latest novel, The Exiles. The Exiles was first published in August of last year, and then the paperback came out in July. Christina was born in England and then raised in the South and in Maine, just the South for a little bit. She graduated from Yale with a BA, Cambridge with an MA, and the University of Virginia with an MFA. She's a resident of New York City and also Southwest Harbor, where she has been for the last 18 months.
Yes. March 13th, 2020.
But here on MDI, Christina is famous not only for being an author, but being one of the 4 fabulous Baker sisters. And all 4 sisters have a home here on MDI, and her sister Clara lives here year-round. She's also the daughter to William Baker, who you might not know was once a football star at Furman University, where my daughter Maggie attends college. She also wrote a book about feminism and the mother-daughter relationships with her own mother, who was also named Christina. David Kline and she are the proud parents of 3 sons, Hayden, Will, and Eli, for whom she dedicated this last novel.
That's
Please
right.
help me give Christina a warm welcome.
And can I just say how pleased I am to be at COA. My sister Cynthia is on the board, who's here today. And it's just been such a joy to get to know more about this incredible place, coming off the Summer Institute, which I'm sure many of you attended, which I found spectacular and still feeds, notice the food theme of the Institute, feeds my brain even thinking about and pondering ways that the events that took place have changed my perception, for example, of tipping, of the way restaurants are run, of how food in America is processed and consumed. And it's just the think tank that you have here is just so brilliant. And this building to me is also just the most spectacular
Awesome
new
building.
representation of what this place is. So I'm thrilled to be here.
And we are so lucky to have you here. How many of you have read The Exiles? Wow, okay. And those of you that are at home on Zoom feeling silly for raising your hand, one of those people would be my mom. Hi, Mom. She's in Atlanta. And she's
That's
a huge
great.
fan. So
That's
you have
great.
to say hello to her, Christina. Say hi, Mom.
Hi, Mom.
Okay.
Is it here?
Yeah, yeah.
I-
Okay. Now, for those of you who did not raise your hand, can you tell them briefly
Yes.
what the book is about?
So The Exiles, my latest novel, which just came out in paperback in July, is the story of the convict women who transformed Australia and the Aboriginal people whose way of life was destroyed when British colonists landed on their shores. That's sort of my micro description. But it follows two convicts in particular, two women from different walks of life, and an Aboriginal girl who really lived. Her name is Mathena, and she was, as I describe in the novel, she was the daughter of a chieftain, so the British sort of considered her a princess, and she was orphaned, and she was taken in by Sir John and Lady Jane Franklin, who he was the governor of Hobart, Tasmania, as a social experiment. They wanted to see if they could turn her into a lady, a British style lady. So they taught her French, and they dressed her in silks, and they taught her to dance, and they had this kind of coming out ceremony, this dance at which she ended up embarrassing them. This was all true, and they were called back to London and abandoned her at a young age, and she spent the rest of her life sort of wandering. And so that very painful story is contrasted in my novel with the story of the convicts, which was painful in a different way, but for these white women who came in and had from a land of no social mobility in Britain, England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These women were swept off the streets for what they called crimes of poverty, which means there were no social programs, there was no welfare, there was no foster care, there was no protection for the poor. And if wherever you were born on the social ladder, 99% of the time, that's where you ended up. The poor were expendable. And so, and there's a fun history I'd love to share with you when we get going. But they, at any rate, they were sent to Australia from this world that was so codified and strict, and gave them as I said, no room to move. And if they made it through the convict system, through the prisons, and got out, they actually had the opportunity for all kinds of growth and social mobility that they did not have in Britain. So for the convict women, it was a different trajectory.
And so it really follows three women,
Yes.
three different stories. Mathena is the only one that's based on one real person.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you developed the other two characters?
My novel begins with a governess named Evangeline, who is, stepping back, let me say, writing a novel set in the 1840s was such a challenge, as you might imagine. I've written two novels, Orphan Train and A Piece of the World, which take place at least part in the past, but it was the early 20th century in America in both cases, rural America actually, in both instances. And so the massive research I did for Orphan Train about Minnesota in the early 20th century was then actually important when I wrote A Piece of the World, which takes place in Maine and is the story of Andrew Wyeth and the subject of his best known painting, Christina's World. So rural Maine and rural Minnesota are not that different in some ways. There was no running water, no electricity, all of these things that I could draw on what it was like to live in, say, a farmhouse, in the 1920s and 30s. But Australia in the 1840s was a whole different battle, a whole different set of sort of things I needed to figure out. And so, but the most important thing for me was how to make the story immediate and appealing to modern readers. And I read this great quote by Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall, as you may know, and these other incredible books set in the 16th, 17th centuries. And she said, "I write contemporary novels set in the past." And I love that idea. My novel, The Exiles, the only way I could think of it without utter terror approaching the writing of this book was that I wanted it to be sort of a hybrid in a way of It's not like a novel that is written in 1840, but I tried not to use anachronistic language, especially in dialogue. I made a decision not to use dialect, which was complicated because my characters are from Scotland, from Glasgow, from London, the streets of London, from rural England. I tried to use sentence construction to convey something about the way it sounded, their voices sounded. The only concession I made was I used YE sometimes. And actually, one interesting aspect of the novel is that the Aboriginal girl, Mathena, because she was the daughter of a chieftain, before she even reached the home of these wealthy landed gentry, Brits, she had a British tutor. She was conversant in English, which many Aboriginal people were not, and she could read and write. And so she was much more educated than my convict women. So that was something interesting to think about in terms of class and race and everything else. And so as I say, I approached the novel with this idea of wanting the story to be really quite immediate. And so for me, as I thought about all the kinds of women who were sent on these ships, these often repurposed slaving ships to Australia, most of them, of course, were, as I said, from the poor, the very bottom of the ladder, but some were not. And I decided to open the book with Evangeline, who's a governess. For me, she was a stand-in for the reader. She's literate. She herself loves reading. And I wanted everything that Evangeline went through to be a fresh shock to the reader, as it is for her. Whereas if I'd started with the next character, Hazel, it would have had a whole different flavor, because Hazel, nothing to her was a surprise. She was used to being treated badly. She was used to getting the raw end of the deal. And Olive as well, who's a character in my novel, who's sort of a truth-telling, impish figure. She's sort of the trickster in the novel. And she manages to convey some of the history that I wanted to get into the book in a way that's humorous and also isn't like a lecture. When you're writing a novel, as I'm sure many of you probably know, there are all these ways of getting information across that you don't want to be didactic, of course, and you don't want to be lecture. You don't want to sound like a lecture, but so there are ways to have characters serve different functions. Ian Forster in The Art of the Novel talks about round characters and flat characters. And he says your central characters, of course, have to be rounded and complex so that you can't always tell how they'll react to things. But a novel also depends on flat characters who add depth and scope. So Olive in my novel, this is getting a little in the weeds. Well, Olive is a flat character, I would say. She doesn't change that much in the novel. She is who she is, but she comes in and has a role to play that expands, I think, the reader's experience of the book. So you start with Evangeline, who comes in and everything is, she cannot believe how shocking it is. And actually, we had talked about reading something. Do you want me to read a paragraph?
Yes.
I don't have my book with me, but let me look at that quickly. And I'm going to just give you a sense for those of you who haven't read the book. Oh, I guess I need my glasses. Let's see here. Old. Of what happened to her. So she is a governess. She basically is betrayed and finds herself in this unfamiliar position where she's shackled in a cart, essentially, in a carriage, but a drafty open carriage on her way to Newgate Prison. She didn't even know about Newgate Prison. And so I'm just going to read you this one. It will take a minute, but it will give you a sense. So now, sitting in the drafty carriage, Evangeline moved her shackled wrists to the left side of her body and rubbed the place beneath her petticoat where she'd tucked the monogrammed handkerchief. With the fingers of one hand, she traced its faint outline, imagining she could feel the thread of Cecil's initials intertwined with the family crest, a lion, serpent, and crown. So the Cecil, as you might guess, is the cad who was responsible for her ending up in this position. It was all she would ever have of him, except apparently for the child growing inside her. The carriage made its way west toward the river. No one spoke in the chilly compartment. Without realizing what she was doing, Evangeline inched closer to the solid warmth of the constable next to her. Glancing down, he curled his lip and shifted toward the window, widening the space between them. Evangeline felt a prickle of shock. She had never in her life experienced a man's revulsion. She'd taken for granted the small gifts of kindness and solicitude that came her way, the butcher who gave her choice cuts of meat, the baker who saved her the last loaf. Slowly, it dawned on her. She was about to learn what it was like to be contemptible. So there's this massive transformation that takes place. Actually, you know what I was thinking, Cynthia, when I was just reading this, is that I wrote my college essay on this. When Cynthia and I were in high school, we decided to go blueberry picking and make a lot of money. Our friends were like, you're going to make so much money, go to Cherryfield. So our father dumped us in this barren field there were migrant workers, but there'd been a knifing the night before. So there were police and there were no toilets. In fact, someone had knocked over the outhouse and there was a stream. He was laughing so hard he was crying.
Oh,
I think I was 16, you were 15. We were there for weeks alone, 3 weeks, no cell phones, no nothing. My parents were like, didn't care. We took part in like a Grapes of Wrath style, protest to raise the wage, whatever. And those, have you ever really picked blueberries? Those super heavy old blueberry things. I got a 3rd-degree sunburn. We were in so much pain. Our tent flooded and we had nowhere to sleep. It was quite an experience. And there was
like Evangeline.
Yeah, there was a moment that's exactly like this, which is that we were with our people doing the blueberry picking, and this family pulls up in a Volvo about 20 feet away. We're up on a hill and they're at the bottom and they jump out and they're like, blueberry picking, how delightful. And they kind of, the father had a beard like our dad and they looked sort of like our family. And we realized that, and they didn't even, when they looked at us, it was with such like, oof, they just really were. And I felt this impulse both to run toward them and say like, please take us away. And also I was so angry at this. I had this class rage about it, that they were, just sort of making light of this really hard job that we finally had witnessed firsthand. So that was a bit of a formative experience. And I do think I drew on that when I was writing that scene. I just realized.
You remembered that now.
I know.
I heard you say that the three life events that helped really bring this novel to light in Australia was that you went to Australia in your 20s, you wrote the book with your mom about mother-daughter relationships, and also that you worked with women in prison, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, that was huge. When I was in my 20s, well, Cynthia and I were in college when our parents went to Australia. My dad was always cooking up schemes. My parents were professors at the University of Maine and at the community college there. And my dad ran the history department for many years, and he was always figuring out ways to go to other countries to teach. So he traded jobs, homes, and even pets, to the detriment of our pets, with a professor in Melbourne. And they lived there for a year. And so Cynthia and I sadly couldn't go. We're in college. And our parents, why didn't we go? We could. They weren't interested in having us there, right? But all I got was this lousy book. My father gave me The Fatal Shore, which is his marked up copy of this incredible book by Robert Hughes. And if you've read The Exiles and want to learn more about what Hughes called the founding of Australia, but would no longer be called that, basically the British colonization of Australia, this book is phenomenal. And it's 688 pages. And when I read it, I was struck by the fact that out of those 688 pages in this gorgeous, comprehensive book, only one chapter was devoted to convict women and Aboriginal people together. It was called bunties, mollies, and sable brethren, which were slang sort of for,
Mm.
and even at that moment, I was aware enough to realize that that was strange and not right. And I wanted to know more, but then I came back to the States after 6 weeks and moved back into my life, did this book with my mother, where we interviewed 60 mothers and daughters of the second wave of the women's movement. And that book was really formative for me, partly just in that I understood so clearly when we finished the book that history is written by men and by the conquerors, by the presidents and the legislators and the warmongers and the robber barons and the capitalists and the corporations, essentially, and that women's stories, many of which are begging to be told, have not been told in history books, and the stories of the poor, that the poor and oppressed have not traditionally been part of our history, and that's changing. That's changing. But I did this book in the mid-90s, and there were all these incredible stories. Some of you may have seen, there was a recent miniseries about the early years of the women's movement and how much change happened that most people don't know a lot about. So we sort of were doing this granular work with these women who had thrown their lives into the air to make change for women with laws and with attitudes and everything else, and then their daughters. And we were looking at how and if feminism is passed from one generation to the next. How do you rebel against a rebel, essentially, was our organizing question. And I think it led me to write about, to the things I tend to write about now, which is little known stories that I think are important to know more about.
Well, what I loved
stories of women.
about this book is about how the women in these desperate situations really helped each other and their relationships. And I mean, it's really about those connections that makes the book so special, I think.
Yeah, and as one of four girls, four sisters, that stuff, I've never explicitly written about sisters, I realized, but those kinds of webs are really central to my life. So I think I do end up in lots of ways writing about that.
And I like reading historical fiction also because you can learn without doing all of the grueling research that you did. I mean, I got tired just reading the titles of the books that you read in order to do this research. And the research was extensive. How do you know when you've done enough research and you can start writing the book?
Well, when I started writing novels, I wrote contemporary novels, and our father, as I said, is a historian and has a dozen books published by university presses. He had one kind of big commercial book about a biography of Jesse Owens that became a movie. And but I never thought I had anything in common with him. Nobody in my family writes fiction, and my mother also wrote books, but not fiction. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I realized I follow his methodology almost to the letter. I mean, we both write longhand. We both take notes in a similar way. He does it on note cards. I have a slightly different way of doing it, but I think I learned to do research watching him.
I don't think they got that though. She wrote her entire book in longhand.
Well,
first.
a lot of writers do actually. A lot of writers
My
do.
family didn't believe me when I told them. They said, no way. And then really a lot of writers do
A
the whole
lot
thing?
of writers do. Chris Bojalian. I was just talking about Kristen Hanna with someone here. Those epic books, she writes longhand. Paula McLean, a lot. So I know novelists, and there's something about Amor Tolls. There's something about the pen on the paper for me that is really important when I'm typing. And part of it is probably age. I just didn't grow up on a laptop, but for me, the tactile thing of getting the words on the page, and also it enables me to play. And as you said, this is my 8th novel, and my process has changed. I used to write quite slowly, and I didn't revise as extensively. Now I write my first draft much faster, but there's a sense I have of needing to capture lightning in a bottle to get the spark on the page. And So sometimes I'll write a scene and then I'll just go straight into writing it from a slightly different perspective. And then the second draft where I'm typing in is in a lot of ways the most fun. First draft is so hard. And also the most important because I'm choosing what of that mess I am going to use as the next draft. And then there are probably at least 10 drafts, but that second one, getting it into the computer and making sense of it is really important. But I love that in writing longhand, I'll often come back to an idea and write on the back of the page. I mean, it's such a mess, but for me, once the black type is on the white background, I can't see it the same way. It's not as fertile a ground to me.
Do you remember the first scene you wrote? The first for this?
I wrote, yes, the first scene of Evangeline waking up and feeling ill was the first scene I wrote. And the story of Evangeline is sort of, I love 19th century novels, those big novels, Middlemarch, of course, Madame Bovary, all of Jane Austen and Jane Eyre and the Brontes. She's just such a quintessential character, sort of from one of those novels. And I thought so much of that in this first scene where she wakes up as a governess in this home and she's not feeling well. And the maid who doesn't like her, has never liked her because she sort of puts on airs and can read, opens the door and is immediately suspicious. And she's just catapulted into this new life right from the very first moment in that.
So was Evangeline the first character that you created?
Evangeline was the first character I created. When I originally stumbled on this idea, there was a New York Times, there used to be a column by a journalist named Lisa Belkin. It was called Motherload. It was a parenting column. It would not be called Motherload today. I don't think. This was a decade ago. But there was this short piece, and she always wrote contemporary. It was always contemporary, but this, I think she was showing that we have it easier than, women on convict ships. So
Yes.
there was this short piece about the convict women on these, as I said, repurposed slaving ships with their children and sort of what that was like. And I read this piece and I just had this full body sensation that this is what I wanted to do. And I didn't realize until I read about this at the end of the book in the acknowledgements, I didn't realize until I was quite far along that it was because of my trip to us, that all these different personal things had led me to, nobody else wrote a novel about the convict women after reading that I know of, after reading the Lisa Belkin piece. So why did it appeal to me? And why did I have that sensation and not other people? Of course, you're drawn to things because of your own life and experiences. And that's been a really important guiding principle for me is, well, first of all, two things. It's with my novels, with each one, I'm trying to get the thing that gives me the tingle. Like, what is it that I have that feeling? And I don't even have to know why, but what is it that gives me that feeling? And second, what terrifies me? And the new novel I'm working on terrifies me in an entirely different way. But I've learned when I started writing novels and I was writing contemporary novels, those ideas I would dismiss. I'm not qualified. I don't know enough. I'm not, it's not my world. I have no right to it. And it took me 10 years, I did 2 novels and a nonfiction book after discovering the orphan train story in my husband's family. Before I felt I even had a right to tell that story because I'm not Midwestern. I wasn't descended from orphan train riders. I'm not a historian. What right do I have to this material? And that's always a question when you write about the past, I think.
And you talked about the Summer Institute, and at the COA Summer Institute in 2019, you spoke with Mbola
Mabui.
Yes.
Yes.
And you all talked about, did you have a right to tell the story of an Aboriginal and the sensitivities around that? And I know you took that very seriously. Can you talk about my book group when we read it? That's what they talked about, in today's being so conscious of that movement. How did you make sure you felt comfortable with writing in her voice, but you didn't use her voice. That was one thing.
Right.
Right.
So this was huge, this issue. So I started to say, and I lost the thread because I went off on some tangent, that I read that article by Lisa Belkin, and then I was going to write about the convict women. That was my task. I was not planning at all. I was, in fact, consciously not going to get into that very complicated territory, which is writing about another culture that is not your own. I mean, it's bad enough that I'm writing about these Australian people, but I felt fully justified in that, in that Cynthia and I are 100% English, Irish, Scotch, and Welsh, and maybe a little French. But those are our people, and we're descended from those people. So some of them just went to America and some went to Australia, and that's fine. God knows we may have convict people in our backgrounds too. In fact, for sure, our father is, oh, for God's sake, he's right. His people, the Hill people in Georgia, of course. But anyway, I got to Australia. I went twice to do research, and I discovered that my story, taking place from 1840 to 1845-ish, it was exactly the period that the Aboriginal people were being essentially shuttled into open air concentration camps. In particular, this island, Flinders Island, that they established, pushed them off their land. So the British came in, as the British do. The French and the Dutch were already milling around, and they were like, nope, here's our flag. This is our continent now. Goodbye, everyone. And then they had been sending convicts here. You probably know, 50,000 British convicts were sent here. And then we won the war. And some years later, about a decade later, America was like, no, this has to stop. No more convicts allowed. So at first, the British government looked at the coast of to Africa, but the ports were complicated. They weren't secure enough. And then they looked to Australia, where nobody else had this bright idea, but they said, wow, it's huge, it's empty. Let's just dump people there. So in the 1780s, they pivoted and started sending ships to Australia. But by 1803, Australia was 9-to-1, men to women, because stupidly, they hadn't really considered the fact that if they wanted to make a colony, not just a penal colony, if they wanted to populate this new land, they didn't have to have women.
Yeah.
So, so that was how they cooked up the scheme to send breeders to Australia. Essentially, they swept these poor women off the streets to populate Australia. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. Australia is, even today, 20% of Australians are descended from convicts. So it was a very calculated decision. And at first, I made a calculated decision not to write about this early period because it was so, if you think my novel is harrowing in some ways, just be glad I didn't write about 20 years earlier when the government sent women not into prisons, they didn't even have prisons, but into the arms of whatever men showed up at the dock. And if any man chose you with no screening or anything, and these were ex-cons, most of them, your sentence was commuted to him and you were his property. So then in the so that was 1803 to mid-20s. And then the British press got a hold of it, this story somehow. And the government was like, maybe that looks bad.
Definitely looks bad.
So maybe we need to build some prisons. So for example, the prison in my novel was a converted rum distillery that they turned into a prison. They took all these old buildings and turned them into prisons for women. And that's the period I write about. Much more civilized, don't you think? You go into a prison. And so I got to Australia. With Cynthia, of course, my traveling companion. Discovered that I wasn't going to write about that period, but the period I wanted to write about was when this was happening to the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and to the Aboriginal people on the mainland. And I realized it would be irresponsible not to talk about
Include
this.
it.
So I had a conversation with my editor. I'm with a big publisher, HarperCollins. They're a huge corporation, and they were freaking out, as you might guess. And we had a lot of conversations about it. But I realized I couldn't tell this story without that story. And I worked really closely with the world expert on the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, this professor named Greg Lehman, who's at the University of Tasmania, and he consults with museums, writers, films, universities, and he's written a ton of amazing stuff. And he read the manuscript and was really helpful in making sure I got the details right. There were several things as a writer that helped. One was that I wrote it in the third person, not in the first person. So I wasn't in the voice of the character exactly. And second, she's a child, not an adult, which meant that I didn't need to have, her knowledge is fairly limited to her own experience. So in that way, I wasn't trying to kind of appropriate an adult consciousness about what she was going through exactly.
Right.
These were just ways that I confronted my own terror about this. And I'll be honest, I still don't know that I handled Mathena's story right in the end. In fact, I always do this, but I told my editor I wanted to write another 10 pages. I did that for Orphan Train. I did a new edition of Orphan Train. I re-edited the whole book and I added a whole chapter, but she wouldn't let me do it this time. But because in real life, as I said, Mathena's story was so tragic. She actually drowned at the age of 17. They don't know if she was murdered or if it was suicide or if it was a drunken accident. She had become an alcoholic. She was caught between worlds. She no longer spoke her language when they abandoned her, and her people, everyone she knew had died anyway, but then she wasn't accepted by them. And she was put into a terrible orphanage, as I describe in the book, and then this awful, essentially, concentration camp where everyone died. Eventually, by the 1860s, there were no full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal people left. Today, there are millions of people who identify as Tasmanian Aboriginal, but they're of mixed race, as they say.
Right.
And so it was, and then the white people didn't accept her. So she wandered, she was caught. And the last scene with her in the novel I ended the novel for her on a scene of connection with Hazel, whom she had befriended. But because I didn't, first of all, it was outside the scope of the period of my novel when she drowns. But second, there had been so much tragedy already. I just didn't want to do that to her.
Right.
But I don't know.
But you also kept true to her story because it was a real person.
Yes.
You kept true to her real life story in some sense.
I kept true to her story
Yep.
in every way. In fact, all
Yes.
the details in the novel, I mean, they were often as little as a phrase, but I had about 25 different texts and I pieced together a timeline of her life. And so, for example, she has a pet possum. That's true. The possum meets a
Yes.
tragic end. All that is true.
All that was
There's
true.
all those details in the book are true.
Which is my book club was saying, why did she end Mathena that way? And so learning about that and that this was a real person, I mean, that helped make some of those decisions for you. And on her website, on Christina's website, there's a whole section about Mathena, the real person, which is very interesting to read as well.
So the chapter I wanted to write was, I actually think I could have handled it better. I think I could have had a scene at the end where Mathena shows up at Hazel's doorstep and is taken in, and it doesn't have to be more than that. I just think that would be a way to give some resolution. I thought about this a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, look,
Well,
I just want to
yeah,
share that
yeah.
when a lot of people and a lot of writers don't talk about this, but you're always going over, there are just things that worry you or that
Exactly.
you worry over and over again. And this is one of them in this novel that I just wasn't quite sure how to handle.
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm so surprised that that's how you feel about
A
that.
lot of writers say it is the way it is and
Uh-huh.
it's done, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about that.
No,
I don't know.
but
I think I teach writing, you know, and I think it's helpful for people who aspire to write or who are starting out, or to know that it's a generative and regenerative process, that it is a learning process for the writer, every
Yeah.
book. And for me, I want each book to push me further. And, you know, so I'm always thinking about what I can do better, handle better, capture better.
I want to open it up to questions, but I have two quick questions. One more question. You had said, I heard you say before that Hazel ended up being your favorite character. And I was curious, did that happen before you started writing or looking back? Or you know what I mean? Like, did you fall in love with her as you were writing about
Right.
her? Or
I did fall in love with her as I was writing her. But here's another little writerly trick. Let me advise you, if you're working on a novel, it's much easier and more pleasant to write about characters who have agency
Mhm.
and who are active participants in their own lives and who can create change and have a superpower, which I'll talk about in 1 second, than characters who are stuck. So Evangeline is in a deep hole when the novel begins, and she actually doesn't have the tools to get out of that hole. Her tools are she's literate, she's beautiful, and she's kind. They're not that helpful when you're on a convict ship. Hazel, on the other hand, has a superpower in that she can heal people. She was raised by a midwife. She knows a lot about the arts of what herbs that can heal, herbs that can hurt, how to get by. And so she has a skill that other people need. So she has something to barter. And she's grown up on the streets, so she's scrappy. And she's not disillusioned because there's nothing to, she had no illusions in the first place. So there's a way in which she's extremely active. I wrote a novel called Bird in Hand, where there's a tragedy in the first scene, essentially. And this woman her life falls apart. And I remember distinctly at a certain point in that novel thinking, how much longer do I have to grieve with this woman? This is so hard. You know, and so in Orphan Train, I made a decision that both of those central characters, Molly, the Native American girl, and Vivian, who had been an Orphan Train rider, both of them actually had a lot of agency in that story, and were sort of determined to push through. And that gives a velocity to the writing. And so Hazel was that way in this book for me. And so that was such a pleasant character to write in that way. Yeah.
Okay. And exciting news. Both Orphan Train and Christina's World were optioned for movies, but The Exiles has been picked up to be a TV show. And tell everybody about that.
Well, you probably all know that especially after COVID, these 18 months that we've all gone through, that the world of media and how we consume things we watch has changed dramatically. So actually, even Orphan Train has pivoted to a series because people aren't going to movies, as you know. But I think this Exiles series will happen probably first because, I'm sorry, men, but I have a lot of men involved in the other ones. And these kick-ass bitches who are doing Exiles, it's an all-female production team. They did Wild and Gone Girl, and they just did The Undoing and Big Little Lies, all these wonderful shows. And they're based in Sydney and in LA. So they're Australian too. And they're just full steam ahead. So I think it's
very exciting.
I know.
I love Big Little Lies. That was great.
Well, the cool thing about a series, just quickly, is that so I had a huge document of all these storylines that I didn't get to explore, like lots more, for example, about Olive. Maybe Olive would become a round character. But they might do, for example, one episode about her that's all about her past. I have a whole backstory for her. So I was able to share all of that with them. And
well, maybe you could change your Mathena story.
I know, we've talked about
right?
this,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. Who else would like to ask a question? And Darren has a microphone.
Because all of our
people in Zoom land. Does anybody else?
You talked about writing characters that you like. Can you talk about writing characters that you don't like and how that experience is?
Yes. So in this book, The Exiles, there's sort of a villain. And I don't often have a pure villain in my books, talk about a flat character. But one of the most interesting things about writing this guy is that at a certain point in the story, you actually do have one of my central characters ruminating on his past and thinking about what made him the way he was. Those are easier to write. They're the characters who are unsympathetic. The trick is avoiding caricature. And so always that was sort of the consideration. Because for me, that guy is a symbol of the way the women were treated by most of the men they encountered. And one of the things I thought a lot about, Peter, not Peter, the guy, J.R.R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, those books. One of the things he talked about is that life was so volatile, and it's an imaginary world, but he was writing his books are based in a lot of history and mythology. And that one of the things that he was conscious of was conveying the volatility of life in that kind of setting. And I was struck by that in my own story about the Exiles. These women were so at the mercy of their circumstances. And there were injustices of so many kinds. And so there's a point in the novel where there's a great injustice that people howl about, and I understand. But I wanted to it was a way for me to signal to the reader that anything could happen in this book and in this story and in this history. And that the character I was just talking about, this sort of villainous character, is a stand-in for all the ways that the women, even when they, like Hazel, had the impulse for agency, they were often denied agency. And in fact, things happened that were utterly unexpected all the time.
Yes. Another question? Other questions for Christina? Sharon has a question in the back.
Hi there.
Hi, Ron.
The metaphor of the slave ship was just so powerful for me. Talk a little bit about how you understood that research and how that came to be in your novel.
One of the most interesting things I did, I can't remember if Cynthia was there, it was in London going to the Docklands Museum. So when I went to the Docklands Museum, which is right on the docks, where all these ships left. There were some were other ports, but the majority left from London. And they had an exhibit there on sugar, the sugar trade. Britain is don't get me started. Britain is just beginning to really take responsibility for their ongoing role in the slave trade. They're sort of like, we were pure much sooner than America, but they were still engaging in trade in all these ways. And I talked to the director of the museum. I was just curious about why there's nothing about the convicts, nothing at the Docklands Museum. I had the same surreal experience touring. I toured many times the Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan, and I love it. It's incredible. By the way, they're doing a huge, thanks to Black Lives Matter and all the stuff in the past 18, 24 months, they're actually rethinking a lot of stuff. But when I was there, after doing all this research about the orphan trains, because the Lower East Side was essentially ground zero for these train riders, most of them came through Ellis Island to the Lower East Side and were put on trains, these children, these vulnerable children, ages 2 to 14, in a labor program. So that was just funneled to the Midwest, 250,000 children. But there was nothing at the Tenement Museum about the orphan trains. And when I talked to the director, she said, well, it's really just a footnote, that story. I was like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So then my when my book did well, they called me 18 months later and said, will you come and do a lecture to our staff? I was like, yes, I will.
Good.
So I kind of did the same thing at the Docklands Museum, having done all this research about the convict trade. And I walk in and it's this surreal experience of nothing about the convicts. They're not quite ready to do that, to address that. But when I was there, I learned, and in my research, I learned that they, slightly different subject to answer your question, they had these ships that had been slaving ships and they just repurposed them. So the women weren't shackled in the orlop deck, which is the bottom deck where the slaves were shackled, but the conditions were terrible still. And they were in these like completely, I describe in the novel, these very small, narrow bunks, and sick and with children and pregnant and the whole thing, you know, all of that. It was fascinating.
Darren, Sharon had a question.
Hi, Sharon.
I didn't know it's on. You mentioned that you wrote this book in the third person, and I was wondering how long, what kind of deliberation goes into that? How do you think the book would have changed had you written it in first person? And are all of your novels written in
Right.
in the same person?
It's always, this is such a big decision, and I think it makes or breaks novels. So it feels very weighty as a decision to me. I wanted an extra step. I wanted the novel to read a little bit like, as I said, a little bit like a 19th century novel. And those are all written in the third person, for one thing. It gave me a slight ability to comment in the gray area between the third person voice and the experience of my characters in a way that I had this authorial ability to give information that they wouldn't have necessarily, for example, and that was really important to me. Whereas in my last novel, Piece of the World, I was writing this incredibly intimate story about a hard to like person, Christina Olsen, who was grumpy and opinionated and spiteful. I wrote it in the first person because I wanted the reader to feel that even when she was behaving in a way like refusing to let her brother get married because she wanted him for herself, even when she was behaving in a way that was just hard to believe. And that story was very much based on the facts of the true story. I wanted the reader to feel very intimately engaged, almost polluted by Christina's perspective, so that you were tied to it. And so I wrote it in a very intimate voice, and also because that book felt granular. It takes place essentially, I felt like I was writing a one-act play that takes place in one room. She really almost never left her house. And so when you're writing an epic like this that spans continents and has so much change, it's a very different experience than this kind of intimacy of falling down a house in rural Maine. And so that was how I made that decision. In Orphan Train, I did a kind of complicated thing that that not everybody figures out, which is that I tell the third person story, which takes place over 200 pages. That's the present day story that I am writing in the third person. But the story of the train rider, which is only 100 pages of the book, is in the first person. And the conceit is that she, the old lady, Vivian, is telling her story to the girl, Molly. And so you eventually, the two storylines meet up and it becomes third person as the story moves forward because you're back in the present day. So, and also in that novel, by the way, I wrote a prologue in which some people say, why did you give away the whole story in the prologue? Because I do, actually. But a lot of people are shocked by what happens eventually. So it depends on how you read. And one thing I've learned is that people read books very differently. And so sometimes you think you're being obvious and and a lot of people don't get it. And sometimes it's fascinating to think about how readers come to your book and what they bring to it.
One more question. I have two more questions. Okay, over here and then Beth.
I read your book by listening to it on Audible.
Yeah.
And so I was just curious, do you have any input into who reads the book or how they read it or anything like that? Or is that up to Audible?
So one of the benefits of getting older, I mean, first of all, I'm bossy, as you know. And yes, my publisher sent me 12 people, and I hated them all. And I whipped into gear and I started Googling great audio readers. I listened to about 40 of them. And I chose this woman, Caroline Lee, she's done all of Liane Moriarty's books. She lives in Melbourne. She's a Shakespeare actress. She's won the audiophile, which she won for my book too, Book of the Year award. And I just loved the way she did different voices. I don't know your experience of reading it, but I thought she was a great narrator. Yeah, she's just fantastic. And so I picked her, I wrote back and said, I hate everyone, and here's who we have to have.
And you got her.
And I got her.
Which is awesome.
I know.
She did. I listened to the audiobook too, and I thought she was fabulous. And then I read it. And Beth has one question. Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you, Christina. I've really enjoyed the morning so far. Thank you, Karen. You are a feminist, or at least you're very aware of the sexism and misogyny that underlies all cultures in the world. And I'm wondering, as you raised 3 sons, what were the 2 primary messages you gave them about interacting with people who identify as female?
Oh my goodness. So that's such an interesting question. Well, my sister, there are 4 of us. 3 of us have 3 sons.
Which is
and one has a combination, and we have a trans nephew as well. And there's a lot of when I think of Hillary Clinton, it really is a village that we live in. Our children are so much more woke than we are, that my sisters and I are all like, oh my God. It's not just us, it's college, it's their experiences, but, and the younger generation is light years ahead of us. I mean, to say that I raised them as feminists, if I had anything to do with it, I'm glad, but they've incorporated messages that are so much more sophisticated than the ones we grew up with. And they're teaching us all the time. It's how it feels to me. And they're also all in conversation with each other. And Cynthia and I, our 2 families, so 2 families of 5, have an ongoing, we call it BKZ, they're the Zeitlers, family text. And there are articles flying back and forth, constantly. And they're all kind of, they call us out if we're not everything. Language, what's that? And each other. Oh yeah. And they're kind of in a range of like liberal to way off the charts. I mean, it's like in our family, the liberals are the, Trumpers. I mean, it is, that's just how it's like. So we have a, it's fascinating. And so again, I feel like I'm the one learning. And in fact, I did a nonfiction book. I edited a book called About Face, Women Look in the Mirror and Write About What They See, 13 years ago. And and my co-editor, Amber, this wonderful woman, are actually working on, we've never quite been happy with that. It would be an entirely different book today, much younger, much broader, more political, more engaged in the world. And I think there's so much interesting stuff going on today in all of these questions of gender, sexuality, identity, race, politics. And we want to do a new one that is much sharper and much stronger and much, I guess, more fully into the politics. And this is part of my own evolution too. I think look at my novels, I write about, as I said, I'm writing about history. I don't want to be didactic or polemical in my novels, but in my own life, I'm doing a lot of learning. So,
And you're working on another novel.
and I'm working on another
and
novel.
another novel. And you can get this novel today. Christina will be signing in the back. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Great job, babe. That was really good. You can join us next week. I actually get to talk with Nan Kyohan, who is lives out on Little Cranberry, and she was the president of both Duke University and Wellesley, and an amazing, amazing woman. She's now at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and so we'll be talking about higher education. And I'm a little bit intimidated, actually, but it'll be fun. So come back and join us. And like we said, get a copy of Exiles. Christina can sign it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Christina.
much.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.